Well, when I was invited to come here, I decided I better read something about Minoan urbanism. Content sent me a bibliography, and I made an effort. I think I at least looked at something by all the speakers here today, and I got out books and articles, and I read some things and skimmed some things, and unfortunately, I went through too much material too quickly and not systematically enough, so that it was all a big jumble. And so when I put my talk together, I realized I don't know enough about Minoan urbanism to really place it in a comparative context. Plus, the major experts in the world are sitting in this room. What am I going to say? I just felt my talk is a little bit different, so pay no attention to the abstract. I'm going to come here and tell you what this is for. Oh yes, I have the definitive interpretation of lustral basins because of my comparative theoretical knowledge. No, I have no idea what these things are for, but you don't do either, right? Isn't that the thing with these things? But I'm going to start off, why do we compare cities? And one is to better understand a given case. Minoan cities, Aztec cities, what I said, Jan asked, why do we need models from other areas? Well, they give ideas. They give us if a model from Ugarit is not going to explain a Minoan site, but it might provide some suggestions. It might provide hypotheses that can be tested. It's a source of ideas and inspiration. And I know I certainly understand my own subject area, Aztec cities, Aztec archaeology, better when I read about other areas such as Minoan urbanism or Iron Age urbanism or other parts of the world. So we can understand given cases better by comparing them. To generalize about a phenomenon. So I'm interested in patterns of early urbanism and how do early cities compare to contemporary cities, or can we do that? Well, comparative analysis is needed in order to generalize and to distinguish the unique from the universal. Lustral basins are probably one of the unique things. They occur elsewhere. It's a Minoan thing, right? But on the other hand, having open spaces, open courtyards at the center of large palace-like buildings, I'm not sure that's a universal, but it's pretty darn common all over the world, certainly where I work. So a comparative perspective gives you this, and to study causality. Even if someone says, well, I don't accept comparative analysis, I'm just working on one case and that's all I want to do, and every case is unique, well, how would you know that every case is unique if you don't compare it to other cases? So this is what I'm going to talk about. Instead of specific things about Minoan urbanism, I'm going to go through 5 general topics that I think relate to what we've been talking about today. Government state dynamics, urban form of planning, communities and neighborhoods, generative processes in urban housing. And then I'm going to make a few remarks at the end about comparative methods, approaches, and ideas about comparative urbanism. Now, in the government and state dynamics, this book by Blanton Fargher, if you're not familiar with it, you should be. This is the state of art in how we understand pre-modern political systems. And it's a comparative study. He's got a sample of 30 cities. It's very rigorous comparative analysis. And it really overturns a lot of sort of accepted knowledge. A lot of people sort of assume that almost all ancient states were autocratic, ruled by despots who ruled with an iron thumb and tried to control everything people did. Now, few of us would admit that. But I'll admit it now. That was sort of my basic model before reading this book. Okay, there's this notion, this is what ancient despots were like. They ruled, and if Ramses gave you that stare, you better hop to it and do something. And this notion of ancient despots, ancient despotism, even infects popular culture. Future despots, right? And then, all these ancient despots, and then democracy began here at Athens. Okay. Well, Blanton Fargher, their key insight is that not all states were despotic and autocratic, and they devise a scale of governance from sort of less collective to more collective. The more collective is the more democratic, and the less collective is the more autocratic or despotic. And they have 3 main variables. Bureaucratization. What's the development of bureaucratic institutions and practices? control over principles, meaning what kind of control over the ruler or the leader is there? Is the leader basically do whatever he wants, has no constraints, or is there some way to get rid of a bad ruler? Is there some way that people have some say in how rulers are chosen? And these are all scales. Okay, they've got sort of a numeric scale. They go through historical and ethnographic data and work out scales for various societies. And public goods. How many public goods are provided? Does a ruler provide a lot of public goods and infrastructure and roads and water systems and provide for defense, or is they just sort of provide none of that? And classical Athens is at the more collective end. The Ottoman Empire is at the less collective end. These are both part of their sample. Their basic sort of social theory is that the revenue source determines the level of collective government. So basically, if you have external revenue, if the ruler gets his revenue from private estates or taxing trade or something, then he doesn't have to provide services or do anything for his local population, his local subjects. He can treat them very badly. But if most of the revenue comes from taxing your subjects, then you have to treat them well. You have to give them public services, you have to give them some say, you have to develop a bureaucracy so they have some say in what's going on. And so basically they have a causal model. Internal or mixed revenue sources lead to bureaucratization, public goods, and control of principles. They have a sample of 30 historical societies. It's historical, it's not archaeological. It's the big defect of this study from my point of view. It's not archaeological. And so all the variables are defined for historical sources. I mean, if we could figure out the form of tax system of ancient societies, wouldn't that be great? Because according to this, and also a lot of theory in political science and economics, is that taxation systems are really crucial in how societies are organized. But who knows how ancient taxes worked? I mean, but anyway, so there are other more autocratic indigenous states. I have Africa, Japan, intermediate, and most collective, classical Athens and Rome, Ming China, and Renaissance Venice. Somewhere, and I didn't actually track this down, but somewhere Blanton Fargher put Minoan society in the collective end of things. It's not in this book, but they've published a bunch of articles since then. And actually, they've begun to apply this to archaeological cases, urban cases, to cities, in some of their articles. And somewhere, in talking about ancient societies, they put the Minoans down the more collective end of things. And I'm not going to talk about that. So collective effects on urban, how does this affect urbanism? In more collective polities, more infrastructure is provided. Okay, the ruler is providing infrastructure, which are things that people are getting some benefit out of. And this could be urban infrastructure or rural infrastructure, that tend to have higher densities and a more complex and intelligible road system. I'm not so sure about the road system. They take cases in their sample and look at whether the road systems are sort of roads going all over the place, or do they make sort of a rational, efficient grid, and project a more visible administrative presence at the neighborhood level. Plazas, state-linked shrines, other administrative features. Okay, because in these more collective, this is one of the counterintuitive things about Blanton Fargher's model, is that in a more despotic regime, the ruler leaves people alone. He doesn't care what people are doing. He doesn't need their help very much. You know, pay some minor amount of taxes, but he leaves them alone. Whereas in a more collective regime, the regime is out there infiltrating society because people have to pay their taxes, has to keep track, people have to have censuses, you have to know who's doing what. And so a more collective regime is more intrusive on the life of its subjects. And so it has more, and the slide I skipped, Michael Mann has a concept, infrastructural power, which is the power of regime to sort of penetrate civil society and influence things. So when you have a despotic ruler, I mean, Weber's patrimonial state that was already been discussed today. Okay, it's often discussed in terms of patrimonialism and family organization, but basically, forgetting about the family stuff aspect of it, the patrimonial state model is the ruler rules and just the heck with what the people do. He doesn't care about the people, okay, because it's a despotic model. So when you have more collective regime, you have things at the neighborhood level that are state shrines or linked to the states. So how do Minoan cities fit in here? Well, that's for you to decide, not me. So that's Blanton Fargher's model. Urban form and planning. Okay, has anyone seen this? Anyone guess what? No. Basic planning model. This is the model from the paper. Thank you for mentioning that, Carl. It's the only award I've ever won was for this paper. And the basic point was to show the planning is not just a grid or an orthogonal system, that there's various kinds of planning and there's various levels or degrees of planning. And I had two features: coordination of buildings, how buildings are arranged in relationship to one another, and standardization among cities. If you find a bunch of cities that all have the same kinds of buildings or have the same alignment or whatever, that shows that there's some kind of planned arrangement among those buildings. And I'm not going to go through the whole thing. These are the various ways that buildings can be coordinated. Simple coordination, how they're sort of lined up next to one another or near one another. Orthogonality, other forms of geometric order, formality, monumentality, and access and viewshed, and different kinds of standardization. And now this has already been applied to Minoan cities. Matthew, in his chapter in Making Ancient Cities, applies this model. It's an excellent chapter. It's really quite fantastic. But there's some deficiencies with that model. And one of them is it's focused on the main civic architecture, the main public features of a city. It really doesn't deal with housing, which when you consider most cities, what's most of the space taken up by? Residences, housing. And so I'm beginning the process of applying this kind of thing to housing, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes. And it's a static model. It's sort of, okay, here's a city plan, how can we analyze it? Which is quite typically the end of a sequence. Now, at some of these sites, I mean, the discussions today of Gornian and sites where you have different time periods and how things change through time, I mean, that's really quite extraordinary in comparative perspective. Okay, most urban centers in most parts of the world that I have familiarity with is you pretty much have the last period. Because as cities grow, they destroy they tear up the old buildings, they move things around, and it's very difficult to study planning through time. So how can you reconstruct it through time? Well, if you have direct documentation, if you have extensive excavation, and you have luck. They didn't tear apart the buildings, you have excavated the right deposits, you've got things well phased, you have a good chronology, which seems you have at some of these sites. It's really quite incredible. Then you can look at a sequence through time and planning. Another alternative is to use what you have, the sort of final plan, and reconstruct earlier things. And one way this is done is urban armature. And I don't know, you guys are probably familiar with this, or maybe people familiar with this? I don't know. Well, that's Roman stuff. Too late for you guys, I'm sorry. Well, in the New World, nobody's familiar with this. None of my colleagues would read Roman. I read stuff on Roman cities, and I start drooling at, there's so much data, and I get envious and give up. But the concept of an armature is there's basically a path through a city that's a major thoroughfare. It's a major path through the city, and it structures the city. It's not planned from the start. I mean, some cities, yeah, some cities are planned. The whole thing's planned out from the beginning, and it's all done. But most cities don't grow that way. It's not created consciously. It evolved through time. But there are principles. People are following the principles. So here's the example McDonald gives, is Jamila in Roman site, and the armature is in red. Okay, there's various orthogonal arrangements here, but they're not all the same. Why? They're following this this path through here, and the path is marked, and it's gates and fountains. And so there are various features at Roman cities that mark the major thoroughfares, and this has been, the city of Rome has been analyzed this way, and a bunch of other cities. But the point is, this path gives structure to the, and I've seen that today in some of the plans from Minoan cities. Teotihuacan, Mexico. Basically, what's called the Street of the Dead aligns the whole city on the grid. There you see it down there, the same path. Although one interesting thing here is that this is the only street in this city. In the discussion earlier about streets, I was going to say something I didn't. It says not all cities have streets. Most cities in my area, Mesoamerica, don't have streets. They're low-density cities. They didn't have wheeled transport. If you wanted to walk from here to there, you didn't need a street to do it. Occasionally, there's special causeways. Maya site cities have special causeways, but this is the only street. No, the rest of it, it's you can walk between buildings, and people argue about, well, maybe there possibly was an east-west avenue too. Urban morphology is another way to sort of work back. And this is an approach that began with the analysis of medieval city plans on how to use historical maps from British cities to go back and figure out the medieval city plan. And it's developed into a whole, I don't know, like a research group, almost a discipline. They published a journal, Urban Morphology. They're now in volume 17, 2013. And I'm sorry this is so fuzzy. I thought I had slides of this and I couldn't find them, and I had a question to either watch college football on New Year's Day or go up to my office and get new slides, and football won out. But basically, you take the earliest sort of historical map, and these are Ordnance Survey maps in Britain. You look at the plots and the plan units and reconstruct the history. So in this is Coventry. These are units are called plan units, and within each plan unit, you can see the plots. And these are the urban, land plots are sort of lined up, and you can each plan unit was created at a particular time, and so you can, by looking at these and how they're related, you can trace how the city grew, and these are combined with various kinds of historical documents to try to reconstruct the period and figure out the known date of construction of churches and so on, and so this method might be something that would be useful. Open space, another topic of planning. This is a typology. I was a co-author on the publications from our research group. Open space, and the purpose of this is to provide a scheme that can be compared among cities, and not just among ancient cities and modern cities. And so we have 7 types of open space in 3 levels: city, neighborhood, and residence. And there's a paper, Clary has a paper that has a sort of a vaguely similar kind of typology of urban space. And I guess one point to make, people talked about, there was some talk earlier about private versus public space, and I'm not real thrilled with that dichotomy, and there's actually quite a literature of sort of people supporting that and attacking it. I mean, this is obviously public space, city and neighborhood. These are things that most people can go to. The residential space, is it private space? Well, it's private, but in a lot of cultural traditions, people come into the home, so it's not actually a part of the home, or maybe all of it is semi-public because people not from the family are coming into the home. But anyway, so whether it's public or private, the point is these are very public. These are open. These are sort of things that people have access to, and this is a more limited access at the residential level. And streets are not just for, well, we talked about this earlier today. Things go on in streets besides just transport. State-sponsored celebrations, protests, I don't know, Mary Poppins. Neighborhood plazas. This is, as I mentioned, this is a key link in Blanton Fargher's model between a more collective regime and its population. Is having neighborhood plazas that are somehow linked to the state, linked to the regime, and it's one way that people are connected to the central regime. And there's just a few random examples. Civic space. This is a scheme I really like. It's not directly applicable to ancient societies, but it's an approach to space where it's looking at some of these are social variables, some of these are sort of physical, built environment things, classifying space in accessible, inaccessible, private, and state, and you end up with this quadrant. If it's state space and accessible, then you go over here, and it's utilitarian, ceremonial, or open air, or enclosed. Now, the purpose of this is a study of city halls, city governmental buildings, and how that's the whole purpose of this classification. So this wouldn't work in most pre-modern cities, but you could adapt something like this. And 2 examples I know of where this kind of thing has been done. One is a study of Mycenaean spaces by Kavanagh. Mycenaean courts, it's in, I don't know, one of these edited volumes. Yeah, and so it's basically taking a series of variables that you can classify space on, open spaces, and The most extensive use of this is Jerry Moore. It's a book on cities in the Andes, coastal cities. The book is called
Power and Architecture?
Power and Architecture or something like that, by Jerry Moore. And he has a similar kind of scheme of looking at different attributes of space and then how they lay out on the ground. So anyway, it's an approach to analyzing open spaces. So what are the kinds of formal open spaces? What activities took place there? And how much formal open space? This is an interesting thing. How does the amount of open space vary among cities, both within a cultural tradition and between cultural traditions? There are some urban systems where there's not a lot of open space, and there's some where there is quite a bit of open space. And what does that say? And it's something we don't really, not much systematic data has been gathered on this. Communities and neighborhoods. Communities, groups of people with social interaction, high entry and exit costs, and peer monitoring of members. Okay, this is coming from economics and sociology. Bowles and Gintis are interesting characters. And they point out, in the modern world, communities can often accomplish things that states and markets cannot do. Right? Because in the modern world, we talk about the state do this, or does the market do this? And well, communities it's a separate unit, and communities can accomplish things. Why? Because of the social interaction, peer monitoring, and so on. All cities have neighborhoods. A neighborhood is not necessarily a community. I mean, I sort of think about neighborhoods as being communities, but a big point of Robert Sampson, who studies Chicago neighborhoods, that contemporary cities, neighborhoods are often not communities. Okay, neighbors are people who live near one another, but they may not interact a lot. They may, you have in poor areas, people are often isolated. But regardless of whether a neighborhood is a community, this is, I think, one of the few universals of cities. Any city that anyone has ever studied with some kind of information, some kind of data, has a neighborhood organization. And Sampson talks about enduring neighborhood inequality. He studied Chicago neighborhoods over the years, and the same neighborhoods, they have the rich neighborhoods and the poor neighborhoods. Even though there's change, there's gentrification, there's people moving around, the characteristics of the neighborhoods stay stable over long periods of time, regardless of urban policies, regardless of demographic movements. And sort of why is this? What is there about neighborhoods? A lot of social problems are bundled together at the neighborhood level, contemporary cities. And Sampson argues the neighborhood's an important level of society. It's not the same as just looking at individuals. It's not the same as just looking at the city. It's its own level. The neighborhoods, I think, as a topic, has really just begun to be addressed by archaeologists and historians. There's a lot more to do here. Now, to go back to Blanton Fargher, how are neighborhoods connected to the central regime? And I'm sort of restating stuff earlier, but in more collective policies, you have a more visible administrative presence. Okay, a something visible presence of the regime in the neighborhood, and the regimes work to reorganize the basis of society. Okay, collective regimes have to interfere with society because they have to keep track of people, they have to count people, they have to know what people are doing, they have to make sure people are paying their taxes, whether it's goods or labor, and they need to make sure that the people are connected to the regime and not so much to their local kin groups and local groups. So, and this is, again, the thing that's sort of counterintuitive about Blanton Fargher's model. The despotic states leave people alone, just let them eat cake, let them do what they want. And the collective regimes, the more democratic regimes, are the ones that are out there sort of interfering in people's lives. The more autocratic regimes, neighborhoods are ignored, which means there is a lot of space for generative processes, bottom-up processes. Just to give an example here, Chang'an, in Chinese, Tang period China. This was a fairly collective state. Neighborhoods were heavily regulated. You have these neighborhoods, they had gates, they had officials that watched the gates. You can't go out at night, you can only do this, you can't sell goods outside the marketplace. All these sort of regulations regulating what went on in the city. Not because they were heavily despotic, but because they were more collective. As opposed to Ottoman cities, where the rule was more despotic, and they left neighborhoods alone. So neighborhoods were on their own. So they were self-organized. There were often gates okay, closing off neighborhoods. Not because there were officials keeping track of people, but because the people themselves decided they needed to protect themselves. They need security. They can't let strangers in at night. And so these functions of neighborhoods are being done by the people themselves. It's not being done by the regime. You know, talk about encroachment of housing onto. You know what the rule is for these Islamic cities? The rule is a donkey has to be, or a donkey or a camel has to be able to pass through fully loaded. You can't, so you can build out up here till they're touching, but on the bottom you have to leave enough room to get by. Urban generative processes. We have top-down processes and bottom-up processes. And one way this comes out in sort of modern urban studies is livable communities. Christopher Alexander, urban planner, Besim Hakim, urban planner, they talk about generative processes developing out of traditional cultural practices lead to more livable communities. And in the sense that people are developing their own rules and figuring out how to deal with things as opposed to a central authority coming in and asserting some kind of standard control. So they're saying in cities today, they're trying to develop ways that people can influence their environment, the built environment to a greater extent than just having a central authority plan things out and in many cases screw things up. Another aspect of this generative processes gets back to communities and the work of Elinor Ostrom. Ostrom worked with common pool resources, things like forestry and fisheries, where people have access to them, but it's hard to exclude people from accessing the goods. And how do you control them so you don't over-exploit them? And the standard modern Western view is either the state controls things or you leave it up to the market. And Ostrom shows that local communities often do a better job of managing their common pool of resources than either the state or the market. So her and her research group have done a lot of ethnographic studies of how do local groups manage irrigation systems and fisheries and forests and so on. And how do they do this? Well, this is her sort of core relationship. The reciprocity, trust, reputation leads to cooperation and leads to benefits. And this is a larger version of her model. And I don't want to spend a lot of time on this. This is sort of the core area here. But what I want to focus on is this face-to-face communication. This is a key part of how communities work. And for Ostrom, it's a key part of how communities are able to successfully exploit resources and to Bowles and Gintis are able to successfully carry out various things that states and markets can't do. And where does this happen? In urban open spaces. So these open spaces, there's been a lot of work on Minoan cities on open spaces, and this is really crucial. This is really at the heart of a lot of the social processes in cities and societies. And I think figuring out what went on in these spaces and what are the characteristics of these spaces is really important. And this whole topic of cooperation and collective action has begun to be applied archaeologically. This book came out, I think 2014, edited by David Carballo with a number of case studies. So just to review some of the non-hierarchical social processes that operate in communities, social interaction, peer monitoring, high entry and exit costs, socially legitimate governance procedures that people agree on how decisions are made and how things are carried out, as opposed to some ruler coming, as opposed to Ramses just staring at you and making you do something. And these mechanisms are based on small group size, face-to-face interaction, lack of hierarchy, and local control. Now, is urbanism itself generative of other social processes? This is the standard view of early cities from sort of anthropological models, cultural evolution. All this stuff leads to the evolution of the state. Oh, by the way, there were cities too. But actually, this is just an attempt at some of the processes of urbanization, population growth, and complexity, which are part of the urban dynamics. They're both stimulated by political activity and economic activity, and they in turn feed back and promote more political activity, more economic activity. And if you look at sort of theories for the development of cities, they often differ in whether political activity is stressed or economic activity. Almost all modern cities, modern theories of urbanization are about economic activity. But I think that most states, before the Industrial Revolution, before capitalism, political activity was more important in urban dynamics. But that's, I don't know, another issue. Urban housing. You probably think this is a painting. This is a photograph. This is how the Mexican government deals with urban overpopulation. It's a private. They get companies to build these things outside of Mexican cities today. The countryside is lined with these. They were building this right near a site I was excavating, and they build these things cheap. They send people out there. They provide almost no services. Anyway, housing form. This is a paper I just published, Housing in Pre-Modern Cities. The reason basically I start off with a typology. Individual house group, contiguous houses, walled compound, and apartment building based on how dwellings are configured and do you have an enclosed unit or not. And the reason I wrote this paper is I'm starting to work on residences at Teotihuacan, where they have these things called apartment compounds. And I was trying to put that in comparative context because everything I'd worked with previously at Aztec sites, you have small single-room houses. And there's not much analysis you can do. It's just you got a small house, that's it. And when you have a more complicated residence like this, or the ones we've been seeing today, there's a lot more you can do. It becomes a lot more trickier, so I'm sort of exploring some of these issues by a comparative study of housing. Now, basically, as you get higher population density, you tend to have more enclosed context. You tend to move from individual houses to contiguous houses. And my impression is that these are my impression originally was that these two forms, individual housing, contiguous houses, were the primary urban housing at Minoan sites. But I think it's probably just the contiguous house. This is probably not as common. Just looking at things at the maps provided today. And so in contiguous houses, there's a couple of forms. One is a subdivided form. You basically start with a lot and then you fill it in. You divide it up. And so classical Greek and Roman cities, this is Pompeii, Olynthus, okay? You set these standard blocks and then their individual rooms are filled in and there's a little bit of variation in there. But the second form, agglutinated form, lots are irregular because you don't start off with a big lot which you subdivide. You start off with one room or one building and you just sort of add and expand from there. And this is quite common in various parts of the world, and I think that's what you seem to have in a lot of these Minoan cities. Another aspect of housing is looking at household size and structure. This is from one of Todd's papers. I really like this work. This was basically my knowledge of Minoan urbanism before starting to read this stuff because I'd read some of Todd's papers. But basically taking the size of houses and the configuration of houses to make inferences about the numbers of people and the forms of organization. Now, what if you have standardized housing? And I don't know how much this is an issue. It's something I'm dealing with at Teotihuacan because the Teotihuacan apartment compounds, some scholars say, well, this was a standard form of housing throughout the city. There's 2,000 of these apartment compounds in the city, and I think like 5 have been excavated. And people say, well, this was a standardized housing. And other people look at the same data and say, oh, everyone was different. They weren't standardized at all. So I'm sort of trying to think, well, how do we understand standardization and architectural standardization? You can have standardized types of rooms, sizes of rooms and spaces, standardization of construction materials and methods, or standardization of a spatial pattern, groups of rooms or rooms around a compound, or some patterns from access, depth, and all from space syntax. And so these are just some of the ways you can look at standardization. And then there's standardization of terminology. Modularity. I was looking at this for Teotihuacan, okay? To Preziosi, modularity is standard room size, the Minoan foot, or what is it, the Minoan yard or something. You know, people do that around the world, okay, trying to figure what's the standard unit. And usually, in the cases I've seen, the people who are sort of promoting a standard unit are really into it, and they really want that to be, and the statisticians say, no, no, no. And then in Louise Hitchcock, in some papers, has used modularity to mean standardization of a spatial pattern. And I think this is a much more common use of that term. I don't know, you've probably...
Actually, Preziosi calls it repeated design elements.
Yeah, and that's the kind of thing I mean.
It's not just about the foot.
But the point is you have some pattern as opposed to just a single size or a room type. You have a pattern, a spatial pattern, rooms are in a courtyard or something that's repeated. And so what can it tell us? Standardized housing. Well, it helps to know who the builder is, which we, of course, don't know archaeologically. But if the state is doing the builder, standardization is done for efficiency. I've seen it written that standardization is done to create a common identity. I've never seen this proven, though. Okay, you can find historical and modern cases where state builds standardized for efficiency, but if someone has a documented case, not just a claim for archaeological case, that the state actually standardized housing in order to create a common identity, I'd like to hear it, because I haven't seen that. If residents self-build, well, standardization for efficiency. Okay, if you're building a certain kind of house, it's fairly easy to build, everybody builds the same way because it's easy to do, or to show affiliation with the cultural tradition. Okay, what Richard Blanton has called canonical communication, or professional builders are used. I was trying to do some, and how would you know if professional builders are used? This is sort of difficult, and but there is some historical data from Ottoman cities that people were using builders, and in several, there's work standardization to cultural norms. If a house is supposed to look this way, and a builder's, he's going to build it that way, because that's what people want their house to look like. And there's also sort of a community of practice aspect to it, where builders, and this has been studied in China and Japan, where builders sort of are communicating with one another, they know what they're doing, and they're sort of building in a standardized way, because that's the way that the architects and builders do things. Another topic with housing is inequality. This is, from my own work, this is a bunch of one-room little houses. Actually, these houses are a little bit different, but this is the size distribution. These are two sites that are close to one another from one project, and this is another project. These sites were all available for mapping and excavation. These were sites we happen to find in a modern city. Now, I'm interpreting the big houses as elite residences, not entirely because they're larger. And this is construction volume, actually. I actually toyed with the idea of using construction costs, as in some of Maud's work, but I couldn't figure out a good way to estimate that for Adobe house construction. So I just took the volume, which is a probably better measure than the area of houses. But these houses, I interpret as elites partly because their size are much bigger than the other houses. They're built on platforms where the other ones aren't. And they have better construction materials and methods. They use lime plaster, and they have squared off stones and everything. So I'm interpreting those as elite houses. Now this site also has a royal palace, which at 17,000 cubic meters is somewhere across the hall over there. And then one of the things I've done is to compare house size to the artifact content. And what these graphs are, these are two different wealth measures where I use ceramic types to create quantities of ceramic types to create wealth indices. And then what I'm comparing here in an early phase and a late phase is the elite house to the commoner house. The elite house to the commoner house. The same comparison on each of these graphs. And the point is, it's possible to distinguish these elite houses from the commoner houses based on their artifacts. Okay, and the two wealth indices are, this one was actually specifically designed to maximally separate the elite and commoner houses. So guess what? It separates them. This is an index that was just taking decorated and imported ceramics, high-value ceramics, and it also separates the elite and the commoner houses. So, and then continuous variation in house size. Instead of trying to find the elite and the commoners, to look at the level of wealth with the Gini index, which is used a lot today to measure inequality. The Gini index in the U.S. is around 0.45. Gini index in Canada is a little bit lower. It's basically if all the resources say income is done today, everyone has equal income, you get a diagonal line. If one person has all the income, then basically you have this curve is completely down here. And then where this Lorenz curve moves up and down here is a measure of how much inequality is concentrated. So in this, 50% of the population control 20% of the income. All right, you see these figures in the news all the time. The top 5% owns, 40% of blah, blah, blah. This is where this is coming from. So 0 is perfect inequality, 1 is perfect equality is 0, 1 is perfect inequality. And so I've applied this to some of these Aztec structures. This is based on area and based on volume of houses in 2 time periods. At the site of Capilco, the level of inequality is very low. Now, this is a village of 20 houses, and they're all pretty much the same. So this is what you would expect. At the other side of Quescomate, which does have, basically this is like a commoner house. The elite house is this kind of compound. What that does is that drops the Lorenz curve and gets a larger Gini index, whether you're using area or volume. I think volume is a better measure because it gets at the energetics of constructing the house and all.
So the shape of those is saying that there are a small number of very distinctive ones.
Yes, it goes all the way and then it zips up because basically there's a bunch of small houses and then there's this thing. This is considered a single house here because this is analyzed by household, and this is interpreted as a single household. And the reason I'm doing that is I'm drawing on some historic data on the Aztecs on how nobles had multifamily complex households. So anyway, I don't know whether, if you define household units at these sites, and if you have the entire population, that's the thing. If you've only got part of a site, then this measure doesn't mean as much. And these sites are great because we've got all the houses, and so sampling is not much of a problem. All right, comparative methods. I don't know, just a few advice. Have a good research question, choose a comparative approach, select your cases, put the features to be compared into a single format or framework, and carry out the comparison. This is crucial. To do comparison, you have to have things in the same form. There was a little talk earlier about standardization and standardization of data description. That has to be done for comparative analysis. And someone raised the point, standardization of data, you don't want to do standardized data descriptions instead of doing detailed descriptions. And no, you shouldn't do that. You need to do detailed descriptions and standardized and sort of more standardized descriptions if you're going to do a comparative analysis. No, I'm not going to talk about that. This is this shows different kinds of comparative analysis. It's systematic. You have a lot of cases and not many variables. A statistical analysis and sort of decontextualized. Whereas intensive comparison, you have lots of variables and very few cases. So Adam Smith's book, The Political Landscape, okay, it's up here. He's got 3 cases. Bruce Trigger's Early Civilization has 7 cases. He's here someplace. Blanton Fargher have 30 cases. They're more down here. And dimensions of comparison, these are some of the things we talk about in this book. Look at this. Cambridge University Press gave me credit for authoring this book. I don't know if my co-authors would agree with that. And anyway, these are some of the, the graph I just showed you talked about sample size, contextualization, scale. These are some of the things to consider in comparative analysis. Putting a bunch of case studies together is not a comparative analysis. These are all excellent books. Okay, they all contain very nice articles on ancient cities. And in some cases, you read the editor's introduction, well, this is a comparative, no, it's not a comparative study. This is a bunch of case studies put together in a single book because you haven't put them all in the same framework. These are comparative studies. Okay, Trigger, he's got 7. Blanton Fargher have 30 cases. Okay, they're taking their cases, they're putting them in the same framework and analyzing them. Now, barriers to comparative analysis. Postmodern approaches where everything is unique and you can't compare things, that's worthless. Particularism. A lot of regional experts are very particularistic. They study their own region And they don't, not only, it's not that regional experts don't care about comparison, but they're often unwilling to do the simplification and standardization. Because to do a comparative analysis, you have to simplify, you have to standardize, you have to ignore a bunch of stuff. But if you're a particular regional expert, you're not willing to sort of ignore all that stuff, well then you can't do comparative analysis. You have to simplify. I found this, we have our comparative project on urban services where we're comparing cities. Our total sample, we're hoping 30. We've got about 15 cities done so far. We need help from regional experts. When we're doing Chang'an, what do I know about Chang'an? And so we contact major experts on Chang'an. Was a Buddhist monastery? Did it do blah, blah, blah? And people are not being helpful. They're not, either they give us, well, this is too complicated, or else they say, well, you can't do this. It's very frustrating. This is maybe the biggest difficulty, though. The biggest barrier is it's difficult. It's hard. It's a pain in the neck to do comparative analysis. There's a lot of restricted forms of comparative analysis, not within archaeology, but in other social science fields. People say they're doing comparisons, and basically they're analyzing contemporary, very recent examples. Phenomenon has been called recentism. People say, I'm doing a historical perspective on blah, 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 and they go back to, 1880. Well, for an archaeologist, that's not a heck of a historical comparative perspective. Or they consider only Western urban tradition. So now I developed this I gave a talk to a group of Mayanists. And, I thought I'd throw it in, and this is how Mayanists do analyses. And they have a site, they have a team, they do results, they do some more results, there's more analyses, they end up with results, and they publish it separately. But then sometimes the Mayanists get together, and they sort of coordinate things, and they talk to one another. Okay, maybe like you guys are doing here. And what that results is, people are still sort of being separate, but they're closer together. Okay, these results are more comparable. They may publish an edited volume. They're more comparable. It tells you more in general about the Maya than if everybody's just completely separate. But this is still not really comparative analysis. For comparative analysis, okay, you have your team, you get your data, you analyze your data, you get some results, and then you have to code the data. And this is the hard step. You've got to take your data, you have to put it in this standard format that can be compared among sites or regions or buildings or whatever, and you end up with some intermediate results, and then you do your comparative analysis. Now, notice here, team 4, okay? You can't have the Gornia experts coding Gornia and the Malia experts coding Malia, and you have to have a single person or team coding all of these things. Because, my definition of open space may be a little bit different from your definition of open space, and so I may measure open space differently than you will. Well, if you're going to really do comparative analysis, someone has to say, here's a definition of open space. Make it very clear and explicit, and then you can measure things the same way. And ideally, you will do this with a lot of consultation with these people, because otherwise you probably screw it up. But you have to do that step, and then you have your results, and then you can compare them explicitly and rigorously, and you end up with results that are truly comparative. But it is a lot of work. It is a pain in the neck. And these are some comparative studies that I really like, and I've gotten a lot out of myself, and I just think they're great models of scholarship. So anyway, I hope these are some ideas that might help you think about Minoan cities and things that might be done, and ways to tie this material into sort of larger trends in urban scholarship. Because, and this isn't sort of, I'm not being altruistic here, so I'm going to give you the benefit of this stuff. No, I think comparative urban scholarship can learn a whole lot from the Minoan case. I mean, this stuff is fascinating. This stuff is really cool. But, how does this knowledge get into more general scholarship? I mean, it's going to be someone like me looking at it and saying dumb things about it. It's going to be people like you who are going to do the analysis and the publication in a format that can be related to broader issues and broader trends. So, thank you very much.